Afternoon, everybody. My name is Newzaira Khan. I am a PhD student here at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. I had plans on visiting Michigan, but unfortunately, because of the cold weather, I wasn't able to join in person. But I'm still really excited to be here and present this really important topic. I'm a social worker by trade, but I'm also a PhD student, really just trying to incorporate my practice as a social worker in big research questions with the Muslim community because I'm also a practicing Muslim. This is a huge passion of mine, and I hope that we can share information and see if there's something here, but also if there isn't, being flexible enough to kind of work through that. So again, my project is called Muslim Media Crisis, and it's a comparative case study of the Rohingya and the Uyghur Muslims. So in summary, what I'll be talking about is the role of media in our world, the idea of media hype, the war on terror, and also its aftermath in our world. And then, kind of going more into measuring media hype and talking about how we can have better representation for the Muslim identity. So when we think about media, the history starts off with, having people write out books. And so, you only had like 2 books come from an author because everything was hand printed. And so media was a really huge privilege. And so what we saw with the advancement of technology was that media started to become more of something that was added into everyday life. And so it didn't become like this elite concept anymore. It became this tool for everybody to talk about things, right? So we were able to share knowledge and share insights. And so what we saw was that there's this huge cultural shift in storytelling. And this shift started happening with television, right? We started seeing how people were viewed in TV. We saw such a diverse range of ideas. And then this idea of escaping, right? Escaping whatever was happening in our world started to present with media. And then as we started analyzing and researching, we saw that it became a business, right? A business that was fueled by public opinion and how, we can really captivate an audience. And so one of the 2 main questions that came up for me when I was starting to learn more about media and media studies was, how do we really process all the overwhelming information, right? Like, we are given so much in a day. It's like we wake up and we get this notification and it's like, the world is ending. And then you have like 5 different vloggers talking about, why the world is actually ending. And then you have another 5 vloggers that are like, no, this is all lies. And so how do we as people really analyze and process all of that? And, specifically in the context of being a Muslim, how does the media portray Muslim stories? And so this is kind of where my questions start trickling, right? And so I don't know if many people saw this example of a Muslim fashion blogger, right? She was brought on the news and all they could talk about was nuclear warfare. And it's just so interesting, right? Because, she's not studying security studies. She's here trying to talk about the intersection of fashion and women, but she gets bombarded with these questions that are tied to terrorism. So that is an example of, the portrayal of Muslims and kind of like this pressure of who we have to represent in the media. And so this idea of media hype started drawing me in, when the media business starts taking off, there's this hype, there's this momentum. People are just starting to kind of share, comment. Everybody's just talking about this event. And so the more people, the better, because there's a community that's connected to this idea. And so what happens is it becomes politically incentivized, right? Everything is centered in this idea. And so it becomes a hype and it becomes an identity. And so this is kind of where I wanted to draw on the war on terror, right? And I think the war on terror, it kind of symbolized, for me at least, the feeling of actually feeling what it meant to be Muslim, right? And what I mean by that is this hypervigilance. Like, I felt like the world was watching me all the time. And, we see this in recounts of all kinds of Muslim stories that 9/11 changed so much for people. And I just want to focus on this quote that was presented by President George W. Bush right after 9/11, where he says, "The attack took place on American soil, but it was an attack on the heart and soul of the civilized world." And so when we look back at these contexts and these texts, we see that a lot of the verbiage that was used was so otherizing towards Muslims and towards anybody that was seen as nearly Muslim. And so what it did was it structured this idea of global terrorism in our world. And what it also did was it created this public notion of fear and added to this creation of an enemy, so we could go after that enemy to solve or to fix whatever fear or problem that we perceived in our world at that time. And so, after many, many years and kind of sitting with it, what I kind of wanted to see was, did the media ever ease people in from the hype? Did we ever talk about it after? Did we ever figure out a way that, how we portrayed people back then, did that ever change? Or did we build a system based off of the war on terror which started in the US? Did it sustain a global war on terror where other countries use this as an incentive to marginalize other communities? And so that's where my comparative analysis comes in, is, what are some of the aftermath effects of the war on terror? How do we really understand underlying motivators for terrorism, and have we done better in describing Muslim crisis? So the two case studies that I draw on, the first one is the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar. And there's about 2.5 million Rohingyas, and they are the largest stateless population. So they have no access to any kind of identifying documents. And so they're seen as invisible, right? And so as you go through the history of the Rohingyas in their country, and what really stood out for me was the fact that a lot of them demanded their own individual state. And when that was denied by their state, of course, there was revolt because they felt that that was their right. And what happened was, when there was revolt, people were pushed out by their government, by being denied rights. Conflicts were happening amongst citizens in the country. There was a genocide, there was mass migration. And a lot of that was also portrayed in context of, hey, there are terrorists in this community, and so therefore we need to be able to protect ourselves, and we need to securitize our communities in order to save ourselves, right? And so that was also a similar situation with the case between the Uyghurs as well too. There's 11.3 million Uyghurs in China, and in the 1980s, China granted this cultural and religious freedom. And so that kind of built this environment for the Uyghurs to feel comfortable to, practice their religion. And at that time, later on, as time went on, the Uyghurs then demanded an Islamic region for their own, to be able to practice freely without the fear of government persecution. And so later, what was described was that the government basically defined this as Islamic terrorism, which led to political resistance. And so that led to, in 2017 and around 2018, a lot of images coming out about like a silent genocide happening with the Uyghurs. And, what was later established by the Chinese government was that it was a re-education camp. So my hypothesis based off of these two case studies is that the verbiage utilized in most recent news reports of both the Rohingya and the Uyghur communities suggests that both communities are tied to extremist ideologies. Again, so this is a very tentative model, and so I'm working through some of these ideas. So this is this is still very, 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 very piloted. So I'm just excited to kind of see if there's something here or if there's nothing here. So what I'd like to start by is by identifying prominent American news sources, because I'm specifically looking at the war on terror. And so what I'd like to look at is New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Fox News. And after I've gathered all these articles that are strictly related to the Rohingya Muslims and the Uyghur Muslims in 2022, I'd like to record the theme, whether there was media hype, and in order to measure media hype, it's how many likes and shares cumulatively there are in that article, and then measuring if words like keywords such as extremism or terrorism was used. And what I'd like to do is a linear regression between media hype and theme, and then a second regression on media hype and keywords. And so again, I don't have results yet because I haven't done it, but it's just an idea that I kind of was like, okay, how do I kind of flush this out and to see if this actually works or if I'm missing something. And so after going through all of that, what I would like to see in future implications is seeing more public tools for kind of figuring out mass information and seeing if it's a hype or if it's actually a concern. But I feel that the trickiest part is, you know, sometimes there's actually like a concern and then a hype and then a hype and then a concern, and then they actually are like this like cyclical pattern. And so the other thing that I'd like to look at is the codependency of social media and other platforms, because we see that with a lot of movements that it's so hyped up in social media that it starts to gain traction in other places. And then the other part is, of course, Western intersectionality in media coverage, right? Like the idea of Mahsa Amini and what happened in Iran, and the fact that it fits into Western values of taking off your hijab and being, you know, and being that like women in France don't have that same momentum because it's not seen as Western. And does that play a factor into the hype? And then, of course, having more Muslim stories, right? Like being able to see that there are such a diverse range of Muslims and cultures and the way that people practice. So it doesn't seem so otherizing, like we're not seen as so different. And then in conclusion, you know, just kind of understanding that the media is such a powerful tool, but so is storytelling, and differentiating questions like what is real and what is hype. And then figuring out the role that the US played with kind of sustaining this idea of global terrorism and challenging the way stories are told in order to continue to work on how we can dismantle these systems that, you know, have been built and how we can better portray Muslim stories. So thank you guys so much. I'm so excited to get as much insight and feedback and as many questions as possible. So thanks.
All right, and we shift gear and we have an in-person presentation for a change today. I think no, for this panel. Our next speaker is Helen Murphey. She will be presenting Populism after the Arab Uprisings, who represents the people. Helen Murphy is a PhD candidate and a former Carnegie PhD scholar within the School of International Relations at the University of St. Andrews. Her thesis, which was submitted in December 2022, congratulations, entitled Representing and Contesting Authenticity, Understanding Shifts in Salafi Ideologies and Identities. And it takes a comparative social movement approach to the politicization of Salafi movements after the Arab Spring. Her research interests include social movements and political parties in North Africa, democratic politics and legacies, left-wing parties in the Arab world, populism, and the diffusion of conspiracy theories. And with that, I invite you here to present the paper. Should I put here? Okay.
Okay, great. Thank you all so much. And a big thank you to the organizers of this conference. I think I speak for every audience member for being so thankful to be here in this place where there are so many insightful presentations and such great and very important questions, I think, that are all very interrelated. At least I know that for my presentation, a lot of the conversations prior to lunch very much relate to what I'm speaking about. So I think it'll be interesting to hopefully bring these ideas into conversation. So I'm going to be discussing the emergence of different strands of populism after the Arab uprisings, so specifically focusing on Egypt. What I'm really interested in is looking at how different types of populism and different attempts to define the will of the people interrelate with each other in a way that I think is insightful for this case study, but also just very insightful in the idea of who speaks for the people. So I think my work is intended to contribute to a couple of quite important debates in populism studies, or just some of which just a bit relate to the very definition of populism. So for quite some time, populism has been considered an ideology. So Cas Mudda calls it a thin ideology. So it can graft onto other ideologies like nationalism, but what populism contributes is a very Manichaean idea of society. So the idea that society is divided into the people who are seen as pure or seen as moral, and the elite who are seen as corrupt, who have foreign associations. So Mudda sees that this essential antagonism in populist rhetoric is what defines the very notion of populism. Its antithesis would be elitism, because populism is a claim that the people should decide policy, where elitism claims that the people don't know enough to define policy and elites must do this. However, other more recent theorists have kind of challenged this or have spoken to certain behavioral aspects of populism. So Pierre Ostagoy calls populism a flaunting of the low. So he emphasizes that populism is about transgression. It's about outsiders who are breaking established political codes. So I think these ideas can kind of be brought together in my paper, where I specifically am looking at how the people are represented. So within populist rhetoric, I find that the people are often represented as a very threatened underdog, imbricated in a struggle that is not just political, but also moral. And the populist politician within this kind of struggle is a lone voice that is speaking for the people against a very institutionally overpowered elite. So the other kind of conversation that I think this paper contributes to is whether populism is inherently anti-democratic. So Laclau, for instance, suggests that this may not be the case, that populism actually can have a liberatory tendency. It can be a positive force of disruption when a system is incapable of resolving itself. However, other theorists do claim that populism, at the very least, has inherently anti-democratic tendencies. De La Torre, for example, while he does recognize that populism does have a liberatory potential, warns that the project of defining the people can cement certain tendencies of exclusion, and that the process of overhauling elite institutions can justify extended anti-democratic measures. The problem gets worse when there are multiple populists. And yet he introduces the idea of populist polarization, where he argues that just entrenching populist discourses within a country can cause a very winner-take-all approach to politics, or a very majoritarian idea of democracy. So I'm going to be looking at the case study of post-revolutionary Egypt, and maybe push some of these ideas a little further through exploring how different interacting populisms and different attempts to define the people can contribute to escalating claims over this sort of legitimating power that comes from popular opinion. And question whether this does in fact give rise to some populist autocratic claims. So the straws on some of the research that I've conducted for my PhD, but is also very much a side project. So I'm looking to turn this into a paper, so any feedback would definitely be very much appreciated. So the use of the people as a kind of legitimating rhetorical tactic very much does predate the Arab uprisings. So Mubarak also constructed the Egyptian people as something that is a population that was unified, but due to sectarian divisions, for example, was portrayed as vulnerable to provocateurs who might inflame these divisions. So he used this to justify heightened securitization and the imposition of exceptional measures. So in some ways, post-revolutionary claims to define the people did run counter to this justification. The slogan "the people want," for example, in the context of the revolution, very much contested this Mubarak's purported guardianship over the people's interests. I'm going to provide a very quick timeline. Apologies to those for whom this is very much review, but I am going to just be referring to a few events, so I think it might be helpful. So Mubarak resigned from power after weeks of protest in February 2011, after which the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, the SCAF, took charge of the transition. The Muslim Brotherhood was one of the big beneficiaries of both the parliamentary and the presidential elections, but protests soon began to escalate. Especially after the President Mohammad Morsi issued a constitutional declaration, which many viewed as an overreach of executive power. This united a lot of the non-Islamist opposition, including leftists, revolutionaries, liberals, and as well as representatives of the former regime. And protests began to escalate even further throughout early 2013. Also, demonstrators on behalf of Morsi began to publicly mobilize as well. In July 2013, the SCAF, headed by al-Sisi, intervened to depose Morsi, and he later won the presidency in 2014 in elections under very repressive conditions. So the first example of post-revolutionary populism that I want to discuss is the presidential candidate Hassan Salah Abu Ismail. An independent Salafi preacher and lawyer, he was one of the first Islamists to join the revolutionary movement, and he was very vocal against the SCAF's involvement in the revolutionary process. So he was disqualified. He never actually was able to run due to his mother allegedly holding American citizenship. He denied this claim and said that there was a large-scale collusion of both foreign and domestic interests who wanted to prevent him from running. His supporters became known for engaging in some contentious politics. As anti-Morsi protests escalated, he began to move closer to the Brotherhood and very much continuing to be against the SCAF, who he feared aimed to disenfranchise the Egyptian people. He received large amounts of popular support, quite puzzlingly for some scholars, from those who did not really share an Islamist or Salafi ideology. Some of this is due to his use of populist themes. So instead of saying that society needed to become more pious, he argued that religion was actually a characteristic that was already present within the Egyptian people. And he argued that they were prevented from having their voices heard due to elite power structures. He called for releasing people from captivity, warning that opponents of the people were trying to restore the former regime. And his supporters often used very exceptional language when they described his candidacy, saying he was the only candidate who stood up for the people and in whom the people believed, pointing to his unique ability to mobilize the public through popular demonstrations. So moving to a different kind of populist trend, Hamdin Sabahi represented a figure coming from the left-wing Nasserist trend. He argued for state capitalism and called attention to the plight of Egypt's poor, constructing the people based on economic and revolutionary terms. He pointed to the grievances that people were suffering. He ran for the presidency and he came third in the first round of elections, so he didn't progress beyond that point, but he did achieve what was considered at the time a very surprising amount of success. So he also presented himself as one of the people, epitomized by his campaign slogan, which I've put on there, one of us. And he credited himself with introducing issues to the public sphere that he argued otherwise would not have been introduced. He often very symbolically represented himself as the common man. He argued that, he said even if he were to be elected, he would continue to take public transport, use public facilities like hospitals. And he often shared anecdotes of him sitting down with folks who were underprivileged and listening to their grievances. He promised to rule not on his own ideas if he was elected, but to represent the wishes of the people. However, as the political situation progressed, he began to join in the rising discontent against Mohammad Morsi, particularly after the constitutional declaration. He began to argue that the president had lost legitimacy, that Morsi was pitting himself against the will of the people and placing the Muslim Brotherhood outside of this normative construction of what the people wanted. He began to refer to the Egyptian people as those who were the ones protesting the Muslim Brotherhood, thus starting to rely on a more exclusionary dichotomy between self and other. So neither of these forms of populism, I would argue, were inherently anti-democratic at their outset. Both did initially acknowledge a diversity that was present within the Egyptian people, not necessarily portraying them as homogenous. But as polarization and as this kind of pro and anti-Morsi sentiment began to escalate, both currents began to use more exclusionary language. So Abu Ismail explicitly opposed the Egyptian people to anti-Morsi politicians in the country, including Sabahi. And Sabahi claimed that the Muslim Brotherhood was governing solely on their own behalf and actively excluding the Egyptian people. So the third example of populism after the Arab uprisings that I want to explore is El-Sisi, who also initially began to rely on very populist tactics of legitimation. So he portrayed himself as a reluctant actor who was compelled by his responsibilities to the people, claiming that he was just responding to what they wanted, and saying that if he had let the Brotherhood continue in governance, the country would have faced an existential threat. So he did really use the popular will for legitimation. Before military and security forces violently broke up Muslim Brotherhood protesters in July and August of 2013, for instance, he called on the Egyptian people to provide a mandate for fighting what he called terrorism through taking to the streets, presenting the use of state violence as to protect the nation as a necessary counter to what he portrayed as the unsanctioned or foreign-coded violence of the Brotherhood. Similarly, when advancing his presidential campaign, he argued that he was only running because the people were calling for him to run in the face of grave threats to the country. And he began to, again, rely on this sense of exceptionality. So saying that he was the only one who could save the country. He said that the former deceased president, Anwar Sadat, had told him in a dream that he would become president. And he would warn the audience to not listen to anyone but him. And using very Manichaean language, so saying that there were those who wanted to help Egypt and who were on his side, and then those who did not. So again, stoking kind of fears of unrest and civil war, he portrayed himself as the country's salvation due to this exceptionality, saying he wasn't just a politician who just talks. However, during his presidential tenure, there was a shift in this rhetoric, which I observed. So initially, he did, as I said, kind of present himself as responding to popular demands directly. So in his call to the people to give him the mandate to confront terrorism, he referred to the people as the ultimate decision makers, using motifs of partnership as he spoke of them shouldering responsibility for this type of action together. But as the years went by, the paternalistic approach characteristic of the Mubarak regime reemerged. Threat narratives about enemies or opponents of the people, spreading lies about the government to turn them against the state, began to be employed. And he used this to argue for the state to take exceptional measures to suppress these threats and confront what he began to consider un-Egyptian ideas. The implication was that what the people truly wanted was stability, and he was thus empowered to take any necessary action to achieve the stability in the face of these threats. For his part, he argued that the best way for the people to confront these dangerous conspiracies was by rallying behind him and showing unity. There was also an increasing sense that Egyptians needed a government that compelled them to make sacrifices that they might not have made on their own. He urged the citizenry to work harder to achieve a better future in the face of austerity measures imposed from above. So this was in very stark contrast to his early self-presentation as responding directly to the demands of the people as voiced via popular demonstration. Instead, the regime began to marginalize those calling for democracy, painting pro-democracy activists as foreign associated and un-Egyptian. So to return briefly to some of the questions with which this presentation began, I would argue that populist conceptualization of the people, is looking at these case studies, can occupy a very ambiguous relationship with democracy that becomes further complicated by polarization and crisis. So Sabahi and Abu Ismail both saw themselves as representatives of the people, and they did both subscribe to the idea of free and fair elections. At the same time, they questioned these results in the face of crisis. Abu Ismail when he was disqualified, pointing to a conspiracy, and Sabahi supporting ousting Morsi prior to the regularly scheduled elections by considering the Brotherhood as having betrayed the will of the people. So this suggests that there is an inherent tendency that populists, or an inherent tension that populists face when they're confronted with institutional results that do not favor them. Some of this ambiguity, I would argue, correlates with a latent tendency to what that comes from instrumentalizing this idea of the people. So by contributing to escalating self-other people elite frames, where their opposition increasingly lies outside of this normative definition of the people, they further polarize the political climate. And as many scholars of populism, including Brunk and Jacobi, who look at characteristics of populist rhetoric, this reliance on very simplistic analyses of complex problems is a feature rather than a bug of populism. And by positing the idea that the people's will is unified and can be embodied by one exceptional political actor to contest perceived failures or shortcomings of democracy, they open the door to other actors drawing upon this very same conceptualization to justify anti-democratic measures. So I will leave it there, but I would welcome any questions, comments, feedback, and thank you all very much.
All right, our last presentation is a multi-authored one, and Professor Ayman Mohammad and Camelia Suleiman, who are both present here, and Madi co-authored COVID-19 in the Middle East, a social media analysis. Professor Ayman Mohammad is an assistant professor of Arabic at Michigan State University. He received his PhD from MSU with a focus on second language vocabulary acquisition. He launched curricular development through hybrid and online classes and pedagogical innovation by publishing open source textbooks for elementary Arabic. He's co-authoring a textbook in Egyptian Arabic, and it's in press, by Georgetown University to advance teaching and learning Arabic as a multidialectal language. He was recently awarded the MSU IT Excellence in Teaching with Technology Award for his effort in utilizing technology to advance open education and inclusive pedagogy in LCPLS. Camelia Suleiman, co-organizer of this year's conference, is an associate professor at the Department of Linguistics, Languages and Cultures. She is the author of 3 books, Language and Identity in the Israel-Palestine Conflict, The Politics of Arabic in Israel, and the third one, the most recent, 2022, Arabic Between State and Nation. The third contributor for the presentation, Madi, is a preceptor in Arabic in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University. Has been working and researching in the field of teaching Arabic as a second language since 2011. He worked as an instructor in the flagship program with the American Councils for International Education from 2013 to 2016. Following this, he worked as a lecturer at the University of Texas at Austin, then a lecturer at the University of Michigan. His current research focuses on second language acquisition and the application of communicative language teaching, CLT. That was part of your project to improve language proficiency. So this paper will be delivered by Dr. Ayman, I forgot your last name. Ayman Mohammad. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I want to thank the organizer of the conference, and thank you first to Camelia for the main contributor in this project, making this project possible. This project was investigated or looked at how did social media respond to the COVID-19, particularly like three different venues, three different Facebook pages from Egypt, Jordan, and Jerusalem. And what's the, so we're gonna go quickly through the argument, and I wanna like share how we collected data and the theoretical framework. Then we focus more on the examples and levels of analysis of the language used there, and how different viewers or different media people on the social media respond and represent this topic. The theory relies mainly on the discourse analysis of order of indexicality and enregistrement, which in this paper, this project, we see that Egyptian Facebook users relied more on humor in spreading information, while the Jerusalem Facebook would be more pragmatic. We see in the Jordan ones, we see more of conspiracy theory going around. And in this like analysis, we will see posts or memes around like COVID itself and around the vaccine and how did people see it at that time. We start with just some statistics about how people in different Arab world saw the vaccine, or how they considered it as a conspiracy, looked at with suspicion. I'm not going to read all these numbers, but like you can see like comparable things happen in different parts of the world when they start talking about the pandemic and the vaccine, how people were like, some people were immediately accepting that, some people were suspicious about it, and it went beyond like looking at this vaccine as a universal conspiracy for related to that they are spying on us through microchips or something. So different theories came out from this, but so in collecting the data, we looked at three different pages. The first one, Kharabish from Jordan, and Asahbi from Egypt. And this is like, the Egypt one is very established since the revolution or before it. So you can connect, like this page is not, is sarcasm, like devoted itself to making fun of everything at any moment. Like it's real time, developing these memes and posts against like political or social issues. The third one is Ask Jerusalem, and it's the Arab population. It speaks of the Arab population in East Jerusalem, maybe. Before we go into some samples, we had some remarks or notes on how people in the Arab world use Facebook in general. We see that there was a tendency to use like social media to mobilize the Arab Spring, and it can relate to like to connect what my colleagues were talking about in the Egypt situation. There was a great deal that started the revolution from Facebook and Twitter. Using Facebook between like genders, there were like some variation, as you can see here, between men and women. Some were, some pages are under political, censorship sometimes. So in different parts of the world, or the Arab world in particular, there are certain contexts that we can highlight through the samples we are giving. More on indexicality as a context, according to Silverstein, is presupposing and context creation process in which users relate utterances to social categories and building recursively on these relations. And that's what creates orders that reflect higher levels of ideological saturation. Such orders are revealing of a widely shared social norms and expectations. So this is kind of the theoretical background that we were trying to look as we looked at the data from these pages. I want to skip on this part a little bit and go immediately to our data. So we had from the first page, the Egypt page, examples from Egypt. In this page, they relied more on memes that you cannot fully comprehend if you're not like a consumer of media or the movie itself. There is a parallel situation in which they impose on the context. They take it from the movie. There was a certain situation from the movie, like in order to get the joke, you have to have an idea about this movie, and you have to remember what this scene was about and how they talked together. And here, like language-wise, you see the two words between the word for pandemic and the word for dumbness, they rhyme in Arabic. So waba, the word waba is pandemic, and the word ghaba is dumbness. And this have like a combination between classical Arabic a bit and Egyptian Arabic as well. So when you say Allahumma, like may God, this is a way to give prayers to God to relieve us or take away like the pandemic. But again, this parallel would not be like the joke is not complete until you know like the scene itself. Because in this, maybe what I could gather from the scene, they were talking about the woman was saying something, and the man was expecting a different word or a different answer, but she confirms that she meant the other thing that you just said. And another example here is the idea of responding to the remote learning, the immediate transition to remote learning because of the pandemic. And this portrays the infrastructure, like making fun of the infrastructure in Egypt that was not ready to accommodate that. And also like the average people would not be like familiar with technology, especially parents. In general terms, people were like the average people were not yet like maybe the older generation is not aware of the touch screen. So he's talking here about like surviving with a button phone, the older one. And it represents like maybe this guy is representing the average Egyptian person who can barely survive on like, and he's not has the luxury to do technology. Another one here relates to like speech of students or speech of average people who were like delighted, excited about just skipping study and skipping work as well. So when students were doing like hashtags like cancel school or like these were hashtags were done by students who were asking for more closure. Like, please close more. Our life is more precious. But like these guys here are reflecting, okay, what about us? We are already graduated. So they suggested, okay, let's cancel work or cancel going to work as well. Again, the portrayal here depends, or the joke, the meme depends on the scene itself. It's a parallel situation. that has to do with the scene itself. So level of language here, for example, the hashtag is in standard Arabic, but the yellow phrase here is in Egyptian Arabic. So the mixing here is intended because maybe in the social media thing, and especially speaking to the government, speaking to the officials here, they would use the standard Arabic as a formal way, like canceling stuff. Okay, and this is another one of how the priorities work for different average citizens, or like maybe this is like making fun of the whole like national response from Egypt in general, that they don't care, they're just living their life and their priorities are different. For example, there was an actual headline of this news here that came out around this time, and people were more concerned about this than other waves or strains of COVID. The life was going on. And again, so this meme reflects the idea of that Egypt in general, or like Egyptian people are in a different world. They are just, life goes on, they have different priorities. And again, the meme parallels the scene that when like two people in the movie said serious things, and then the third guy just came up with a totally irrelevant idea. Again, responding to personalizing COVID itself was very common. Like this is one example. When if you cancel, like when the government cancels school, like the expectation should be that people stay home, but they will celebrate outside. And so the personalization here of COVID, like talking that I still exist. If the school is not there, I'm here. And this is making, of course, referring to the symptoms of COVID. When you see like the meme is the joke is only in the facial expression of the guy here. That he got something that he thought it's water, but it's 7-Up, but he doesn't feel it because he has COVID. He doesn't have the sense of taste. These are basically some examples that kept, or like meme that kept publishing instantly responding to the situation. And this page was very active during the any political turmoil or political events that happen. They would make like memes while maybe the president is speaking. They made memes on the actual speech itself right away, and they publish. And this is like reflects the general tendency of the Egyptian youth in general when they like make fun of the worst like tragedies. They would make this like in a meme. Some examples from Jordan and like here they rely on some universal theme. And this like picture refers to a famous chef, I think Nusrat or something. Yeah, and like by staying home, like the creator of the joke here refers that when men stay home, they will become chefs. Like this. So this is this one from Jordan also refers to the conspiracy theory, and it rhymes with a song, a famous song that, and also only changing. So this is the original song, and they change the lyrics to match the situation here. And it refers to the conspiracy theory behind the vaccine. It was not accepted at some point. example from East Jerusalem. And like when they take such a picture, they feel like life is going on. There is nothing shows that there is COVID around. And this was taken during the peak of the pandemic. This was just a post on the page, which is like so pragmatic, just asking a pragmatic question. Okay, how it is COVID now and everything is running. Another pragmatic thing from East Jerusalem example, showing a picture from the World Health Organization when they talk about the statistics. And so they just concerned about, they follow the numbers one by one. Okay, again, we argue in this paper that we see the Egyptian Facebook users rely on humor in spreading information about COVID, while the Jerusalem Facebook users seems to be more pragmatic. For the Jordan ones, they could highlight some conspiracies. So in general, the Facebook content reflects the user's social and political imaginaries, reflecting contextual realities of their lived experience under different political regimes. And I'll stop here and we can extend the conversation. Thank you.
I mean, you took it out a little bit. Maybe you want to see numbers. There we go. Oh, you wanted, image number 6. But we will do that at the end, probably. Thank you, all presenters, for those lovely papers delivered in person, online, or recorded. The floor is open for questions, and all the participants are available to answer any or all your questions you may have. And this can be for online attendees as well as in person sitting here.
I have a question. So yeah, regarding, I thought the papers were great, and my question actually pertains to the last presentation. I wonder if maybe, Ayman, if you could elaborate, Dr. Mohammad, if you could elaborate on the reasoning behind why there's more humor in the Egyptian ones and pragmatic responses in the Jordanian ones.
Camelia can talk more about it. she knows more about this area of the world. Egyptian, more humor in the Egyptian side, because they take everything, like even the worst tragedy, they would make fun of that and make it into, like recently there has been like a very big economic drop in the Egyptian pound, and they take this also make memes around that, like talking about the chicken prices and all this, like we cannot get in that also in a humorous way, like taking the pragmatic aspect on the Jordan side or the Jerusalem side. We can Camelia.
Okay, thank you. I may just add to Ayman that the giraffe's name is Sousa. It's not any giraffe, it's the giraffe Sousa. Yeah. Well, Jerusalem is a very sad situation because of the censorship. This public page, Ask Jerusalem, it also lists advertisements if somebody wants to sell a car, if someone has to rent, looking for a house to rent, etc. So it's for the service of the community that is now really isolated inside the walls of Jerusalem, not part of the West Bank, but not really Israeli because they're not Israeli citizens. And since we did that research, that particular page, Ask Jerusalem, was shut down many times, and then they start all over again. Sometimes they put a different sign after it, so to make it different than the first time, and then they go back. We also have to remember that there are moderators. Each of these Facebook pages, even the Egyptian, they have moderators who decide whether something should be published or not. And I managed to talk to one of the moderators of the East Jerusalem page, and he told me that the censorship is really brutal, and anything could be considered political, anything. Now, during the Sheikh Jarrah events, not this spring, the spring before, Facebook also here in the US decided to shut down Facebook's anything with the word Palestine, for example, in Arabic. The algorithm will read it and they would shut it down. So they became more inventive. They started writing without the Arabic dots. And it is readable, actually. To my surprise, I was able to read. And they said, well, it's part of our tradition. That's how Arabic script started. The Quran, the first copy of the Quran was without the diacritics. So it is readable. And another shift that happened is to move to TikTok, which is less monitored. And some students I was in touch with from East Jerusalem are already doing research on TikTok, and it's very interesting. I want to say that also most of the research on the media and social media is done by East Jerusalemites who are doing a doctorate or a master's at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. So, for example, they write about the fear and the anxiety of what can be considered political and not be able to talk about. They feel abandoned by the Palestinian Authority, they feel marginalized, but they don't feel protected at all, unlike maybe people in the West Bank who have the umbrella of the Palestinian Authority. So the marginalization, the censorship, that's very brutal, and so they self-censor. They decide immediately what to censor. Now, the history of censorship is very long and before the social media even, and it penetrates all aspects of life. There, I don't need to explain how many books get censored for no good reasons. Even sometimes because a book is published in Lebanon, and Lebanon is an enemy country, you can't have it in Jerusalem. The reasons like that, school books are censored from the Palestinian Authority in Jerusalem. So it's a very, very sad situation.
Yeah, recently Turkish president banned all the journalists from criticizing the failure of the state in the case of the earthquake, responses to earthquakes. So sadly, all those censorships have long history and they still continue. Right? Yes. So, are there other questions?
Thank you.
There's one question in the chat here. Do these findings give any projections for responses on social media in other countries in the region? Is this for all presenters, or is it for Professor?
That person can type that in the Q&A to clarify. And actually, we have a question until then.
Thank you to all of the presenters. I just had two sort of comments that link to questions for the last two presenters. Can you hear me? So the first one was with regards to COVID in the Middle East. Like, as I've been attending the American University of Cairo, that I found out that there were protests at the beginning of COVID to keep school going, because people would be too devastated to go home to their parents if there was quarantine, which I thought was very, like, there's generally like a dismissal of COVID, and there's this like denial that if you're drinking the tap water, if you're eating food from the streets, you cannot possibly get COVID, you're completely immune. And also I read this article recently about the differences between Egyptian and Lebanese and American humor styles, because I was just very interested in also recognizing what's different about a Palestinian humor style, and maybe there is none, I don't know, there's something so different in.
No, the Jordanians don't have, we have.
You're right, you just proved your point, thank you. But this article concludes that there's actually a gender difference. So I was wondering if you guys also find this in your personal experiences. I don't know if there's ever been studies of this, but in my experience, I find that Egyptian, I'm just thinking about Egyptians. Egyptian women tend to be more shy about making these kinds of crude jokes, and the references to film and this like meme format is very popular and circulated around men, like between men, and it's like this. I wouldn't even call it homosocial. It's not that, but it's like it is a shared language. I was wondering what you guys thought about that. And then, yeah, I'll read it.
And Ayman, you have that last question.
Okay, yeah, yeah, I can take both questions in one shot and see. Yeah, I think I like the idea of styles of humor. And I think that if we are talking about the Arab world in general, or more broadly, the Muslim world, starting with the Arab world, I think they would like, we haven't looked at that, but if we look, we will see different styles of humor. They will still take this in a humor way. You will still talk about COVID in some humor, because it was the norm at this time. But which way of which style of humor, that's a big thing. It is a big question to answer. And I think it makes sense that if we do an experiment in which like have different countries or like jokes or memes from different countries, it would not echo the same way. Like so Egyptian joke would run between Egyptians and maybe other neighboring countries because of the frequency of the media. The Egyptian media is very famous around the Arab world. This is one factor, but other Arab countries would have different humor reaction that may not be perceived the same way. So this is one important point. If we look at the Islamic or the Muslim world as a broad picture, you could start to see here more as organized or more pragmatic perspective. At the lower level, there were like we saw some let's say superstitious way of dealing with things, like talking about like Muslims cannot get COVID because like they pray or they make like wudu before prayer. And at the higher level, we talk about this kind of discourse that takes the idea of like how we can take from the Muslim faith what protects you from COVID, how to take the sanitary perspective of Muslim way of life to get away from COVID, taking reasons, of course, not the like superstitious way. So like different on the level of between the average people versus maybe the organizational part, like in a recent research, like we were searching the Muslim world reaction through Facebook. Camelia can continue.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yes, we looked at the two public Facebook pages here in the US, two Muslim, the biggest organizations, one in Chicago and one in Indiana, and they have tens of thousands of followers. And it's exactly what Ayman was saying, but we didn't include that in this paper. We started looking into that. The Muslim way of life is very apparent in these Facebook posts about COVID, how to make sense of COVID through a Muslim worldview. Yeah. Okay.
Are there other questions from the audience?
I could sneak in a question,
Yes, go.
unless you have one.
I have one,
Oh,
but
no, you go first then.
My question is, of course, for the first speaker, Dr. Anas, and looking at the magazine Sabila Rashad, and since we are talking about censorship, and it was known as a magazine that promoted, a bit more conservative values at a time when change was rampant. And could you talk about a little bit about reception based on maybe more India or in general, whatever that magazine reached at its prime in early 20th century?
I think there is not much data about how much these magazines had reached to many parts of the world, and especially in Indian subcontinent. However, because the contemporary scholars, they had not mentioned Sabila Rashad and Sirat al-Mustaqim much, especially I'm talking about Indian scholars. For example, Sabila Rashad is publishing almost regularly everything about Maulana Abul Kalam Azad and Shibli Nomani, but rarely I have seen any reference of Sabila Rashad or Mehmet Akif in the writings of Maulana Abul Kalam Azad. And maybe because they were Indian leaders were so much occupied by their domestic issues. But the thing is that Turkish affairs were deeply influencing Indian Muslims, and to some extent Mehmet Akif was more popular, and some of the correspondents who were there, they were popular, and their articles and their things have come there. However, my own understanding of Islamism in India and Islamism in Turkey, I can clearly see that perhaps the Turkish Islamism has not much influenced Maududi or the Indian Islamism, and vice versa. Maududi, in none of his book he mentions Turkish Islamism at all. He does not mention at all Mehmet Akif in any of his books. I have read dozens of his books. So it means that Turkish scholars were not that much seen in these writings. However, as a popular thing, they were known to Indians.
Okay, I have a question for Newzaira Khan and then also one for Dr. Helen Murphey. So I'll begin with Newzaira. Newzaira, we know that there are studies that show that media portrayals or discussions of Islam and Muslims have been overwhelmingly negative. For example, in 2013, Media Tenor had a study which showed that articles on Islam were overwhelmingly negative and not many positive, not much positive representation. Same thing for articles. In 2018, 2019, there's another study that showed, again, overwhelmingly negative articles. But are we turning the corner? Is there some improvement? What's your sense of where we're headed?
I feel like the movement is going towards a positive way, and I think I'm going to reference what we experienced earlier today with the portrayal of like Miss Marvel and Mo, and just having more entertainment that's also being able to represent like more diverse ranges of Muslim ideas and views. And I think that's like the stepping stone that's showing us that, hey, we're moving from having this like image that was seen as so negative towards this positive image because of how much representation that we're starting to receive. And so I also see that with social media as well too, with different platforms that are being kind of shown with how different Muslim voices are starting to be represented as well too. So the sense is that for me, I'm noticing that it doesn't feel as kind of like this like quiet, like, oh, like, like Muslims, but now we're like, okay, like we have voices, we're having representation on YouTube and different platforms, which is allowing us to be able to spread more diverse ranges of our views.
Very good, thank you. Dr. Helen Murphey, the perception of al-Sisi, I have Egyptian relatives, and I remember getting some very lively discussions with them about CC, and I think you did a really good job showing the evolution of his portrayal. And I'm curious now with the dollar, one Egyptian, $1 is like 30 Egyptian pounds now. There's a lot of concern. What are you seeing as far as where we're headed with regard to the perception of the CC, the reception and the perception of the CC?
Well, thank you so much. So just a quick update. I have my thesis defense next week, actually. So not quite a doctor yet, but let's hope. Hope it all goes well. Yeah, so I mean, I do think that that sort of evolution touches on a point that is related to some of what I spoke about, where populist leaders also face attention when they enter power and they're unable to provide to really deliver on their promises, where one person, however much power they aggregate, there are structural factors that are very much beyond their control. So I think, if Egyptian history is anything to go by, at least when Mubarak faced similar issues, further state isolation and, is often further securitization is often the way that such challenges are dealt with. So I guess that's the pessimistic outlook. But I mean, I think, as some of the other presentations have illustrated today, there's also a lot of optimism. I mean, I think Dr. Jamal's keynote about Tunisia, but, it's not as if the Arab Uprisings experiment meant nothing either. And, there's, hopefully some of those ideas are still circulating and could become salient in the future.
So much. I know Dr. Russell had a question as well.
I want to thank the panelists for a great set of presentations. I know we're running short, so I'm going to make this almost a yes or no question for each of you. In media studies, the idea that the medium is the message, that the form of media actually is more important than the content. But actually, it seems that all the papers on this panel are arguing the opposite, that it is the content, that it's the context rather than the medium, given that we have print, television, social media, political speeches as mediums. So I'm guessing, is the medium the message, or is the content the message? I guess that's my question to the panelists. So I can keep it short for our 1 minute left.
Any takers from panelists?
I would say it's the content. And I think I would say it's the content is that, because even from today's presentation with humor, right, it's the content of humor that's driving the message and how we're kind of registering everything as well too. So I would say it's the content.
I'm going to say a very cop-out answer and say that the content and the medium co-create each other. I think that media forms are important in that they structure what is possible to say, but the content is, agency does matter. And I think, a lot of the presentations today in this panel and then across the board have illustrated that.
So and the context plays a big role, and in the case of Egypt, you have to be really an insider to the culture to understand. And without Ayman, they weren't that apparent to me. You have to be Egyptian to understand what was going on. And in East Jerusalem, it's you have to read between the lines, because you can't say what you mean.
Yes. Nobody can understand the way you sprinkle salt in a particular fashion in the context of coronavirus unless we listen to that.
If I would like to say, when Marshall McLuhan said this thing, that medium is the message, at that time, because the medium was quite transformative, the entire bedrooms were changing. I remember I was visiting Istanbul in one of the old apartments, and I saw that these apartments were differently designed. So I asked why these apartments are differently designed. They told me that at that time, television was not that popular. So there was no room for television. And since televisions came, so the house started changing, and one big room has been given for television. And it is how the family came together and the medium became stronger than message. But today, if you see the social media and other mediums, there is a huge competition between medium and message. And perhaps in this competition, medium is somehow dominating because it is more manipulatable. Corporate sector can effectively use medium, and the content producers, like we say, they are laborers, but basically we as a Facebook user, we are not just user, but also we are a free laborer. We are working for social media. So in this way, the competition between the medium and the message is becoming intense, and perhaps at this time more in favor of the medium.
Thank you again. Any other questions? Going 1, 2, 3. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for the lovely presentations. Let's give a round of applause, an enthusiastic one for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Everett. Really appreciate it. Thanks to all the panelists. That was great. So we have one more panel in about 12 minutes.